Are you planning to vote next week?
I am, indeed, yes.
And have you decided who you're going to vote for?
I am still currently undecided, as a matter of fact.
It's the day before the presidential election. A lot of people have already voted. And even if they haven't, it's safe to say that they have already made up their minds. But not everyone. Last week, one of our producers talked to Richard Schall in Michigan.
I think personally, I'm going to consider it the entire way, all the way to the polling station, because it's very important to me to keep an open mind. I could have my mind made up today, and I could hear something tomorrow that could change my mind.
Voters like Richard are important because people like him who are still making up their minds in key swing states, they might actually decide the election. So for months, we've been talking to these people who we call the deciders.
They had to fit a few key characteristics. They needed to live in an important state, and they needed to not be fully committed to a candidate. So we were really interested in what made these voters tick, and we wanted to follow them throughout the election campaign.
Scott Clement is the polling director for the Washington Post. He says the goal of the project was to understand the voters whose choices could actually swing the election. They're from places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Georgia. And there are more of these uncommitted voters than you might expect.
We've been surprised early in the project at how big this group is. There's a lot of people who don't turn out in every election, and there are a lot of people who, early in the campaign, aren't fully committed to the candidates. So there's a lot of deciding to do.
The Post has followed these voters over the last 6 months, as some who were initially undecided made up their minds, and others didn't.
Do you think if you had to vote right now, you know which way you would go?
I don't. So if it was like the polls are open, I got 30 minutes left, I think I would go with Harris, but it would be tough. Like I would be standing there for a minute.
Yeah, it'll be like, while I'm standing there, we'll see what the pin does. But yeah, at this point, I'm just really tired of the whole thing.
Last week, Post Reports producers Laura Benshoff and Peter Bresnan called up a bunch of these voters to get a sense of where their heads are at. These are the half dozen people you'll hear from throughout this episode.
My name is Emily Dems. I am 33 and I live in Metro Detroit.
My name is Richard Schall. I am 31 years old and I live in Latrobe, Pennsylvania.
My name is Malik. I'm 27 and I live in Stone Mountain, Georgia.
So my name is Casey Campbell. I'm 30. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
My name is Julio Sanchez. I'm a roofer laborer, and I live in a little town called Milroy in Pennsylvania.
My name is David. I'm 46 years old. I'm a resident of the state of Michigan. I work in the automotive industry as an engineer here.
From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, November 4th, the day before Election Day. So we are following all the latest polls and how voting is going so far. And this week, we're going to be here in your feeds, keeping you updated on what we know. On Tuesday, our episode is going to come out earlier than usual, and we're going to be walking through the most likely paths to victory for Vice President Kamala Harris and for former President Donald Trump, and what to watch for as you follow along with the returns on Tuesday night. Then we'll have an episode out bright and early Wednesday morning to share what we know so far about the results. And whenever a winner is called, we will be back in your feeds as quickly as possible with the latest reporting on what's happening. But first, today, we hear some of the crucial swing state voters who are still deciding who to vote for. And our polling director will talk through the big inflection points where people started to make up their minds. So, Scott, I want to understand how you identified these voters that we're calling deciders. Like, what makes a quote-unquote decider a decider?
Well, by definition, we had to choose some elements of what made a decider. And the big ones were you either weren't consistently voting in presidential elections or you were not definitely going to support Biden or Trump in the spring of 2024. So you were in play, basically. You were potentially winnable by either of these candidates, or you might not vote. These were people who had a genuine decision to make.
both Biden and Trump are really, really old and not with it.
It's very easy to say, promise the world. But at the end of the day, having those promises come true is something completely and drastically different.
I try to take it by the candidate, not necessarily the party. And I definitely have no issue with splitting my ballot.
I can't even really watch television anymore because every commercial break in here in Michigan, because it's a battleground state, is one political ad after the other. I'm really tired of seeing both of them.
And which states were you looking at for these people?
Well, in the spring, we started with 6 battleground states. That included Georgia and Nevada and Arizona, as well as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In our second wave in the fall, we added North Carolina to that. So we had 7 full states. North Carolina became a clear battleground state by the fall.
And is there a general profile for a decider?
There were a few things that stood out. One, where they were younger. This makes a lot of sense. Voters don't, form their strong political beliefs until they get older. They were significantly more likely to be non-white. They also just had generally less committed views on a whole bunch of political issues.
The last election, I think I might have not voted in the last election, but I did the one before.
And of course, one of the factors of being a decider was not turning out in one of the last 2 elections. So they're on the fringes of the electorate.
Did you vote for Trump in the 2020 and 2016 elections?
I did not, actually. I voted third party in both of those. I voted for Jill Stein and Joe Jorgensen.
So you were able to pick this group of quote-unquote deciders to represent the undecideds we know that are out there. What percentage of voters are deciders or undecided?
Well, it's surprisingly big. The share of Americans who live in one of these swing states is pretty small, but within that geography, 61% of registered voters qualified as deciders, either by being a sporadic voter or by being uncommitted to a candidate, which is pretty high. That's much higher than the share who report being undecided in a typical poll. It's because there's a lot of churn in the electorate from election to election. That's the biggest factor in it.
And kind of counter to the narrative that we're hearing right now, right? That it seems like there's this joke about the last 3 undecided people in Pennsylvania, or these individuals that haven't managed to figure out yet who they want to vote for. But what you're saying is that that's actually much more common than what many people realize, especially in this world where it seems like everyone is ossified as a Trump supporter or a Harris supporter, that there really are a lot of people out there who are still between the two or kind of agnostic.
That's right. When an election comes down to 10,000 votes in a state, that's not just the function of those 10,000 people who made a decision. That's a function of the millions of people who made a decision throughout the campaign.
My family is definitely more conservative. Friends are in the middle and also critiquing the Palestine-Israel issues. So it's really conflicting. It's a huge inner conflict right now.
So when was the first time that you polled the deciders?
We polled the deciders in spring of 2024. We wanted to get out there before much of the campaign had happened, but after the major candidates had been decided. Of course, that turned out not to be the case. We had a change in the Democratic Party candidate, but it provided an opportunity to get in early enough that people were paying attention to the election, but still with many decisions to be made.
Yeah, I mean, as you point out, a lot changed from the spring to now. Of course, there's a different presidential nominee on the Democrat side, but also, I mean, a bunch of other stuff happened in the race over the summer as well, and in the months after you first polled these folks. Can you talk through some of the events that we saw that started to change how people were thinking or might have been an influence in people understanding this election?
Well, you pointed to the big one, which was Democrats changing their nominee.
Another twist in what has already been a historic election cycle. President Biden says he will end his re-election bid.
President Biden dropping out as the candidate, endorsing Kamala Harris.
President Biden upended the political world, announcing, "I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president."
We went back to these voters right after that and asked them what they thought of it. Generally, the responses were pretty positive, if not just critical of Biden.
Yeah, so when it was Biden-Trump, I definitely thought Biden was going to lose.
Biden was on his way down. You know, he was losing it his age, I think, was getting to him.
How are you feeling these days?
I'm feeling a little bit optimistic. Harris is now taking over.
And so that was an indication of how some of these voters received that. The other one was the Republican National Convention.
Hello, RNC. Is there any doubt who's going to be the next president of the United States?
Which I want to point out came right after the first assassination attempt against Trump, which was another huge moment from the campaign this summer.
And moved my right hand to my ear, brought it down. My hand was covered with blood, just absolutely blood all over the place.
That's right. There was a really full summer of campaign events and surprises. We think of these presidential campaigns as really predictable, and sometimes they can feel rote, but there was an enormous amount of surprises this summer.
And also Donald Trump's conviction, which came earlier.
That's right.
In a verdict that is both remarkable and historic, a jury has found former President Donald J. Trump guilty of 34 felonies.
An historic moment as he becomes the first former president charged and now convicted of a felony.
And then finally, we had a couple presidential debates. The first one ended up being pretty important because I think a lot of people view that as what set off this change from Biden to Harris as the nominee. But then we had this second presidential debate between Harris and Trump. And I know that you talked to folks after that debate to see if it influenced how they were thinking about their vote. Tell me what you heard from people in the aftermath of that debate.
We did a live reaction event, really, with roughly 24 of these deciders who were not yet committed to the candidates.
How did that work? What is a live reaction event?
Think of a focus group where the voters aren't talking to each other. They're just talking to us. So what it allowed us to do was to ask people to tell us who they supported before the debate. We only kept people who were still on the fence about who to support. And then when something happened in the debate, we could go right to them and ask, what do you think about this? Do you agree or disagree with what the candidate said, and why? And that was really fascinating. The reactions to several of Harris's comments during the debate were received really positively.
Harris, she bring energy back, the spark. I think the debate that she had with Trump, I think it went outstanding.
Trump's were received pretty negatively.
And she just wiped the floor with him because he just kept going back to the border. And then she's like actually answering the questions.
Interesting. What were some of the moments that came up for people specifically where Harris said something or Trump said something that made them see Harris more positively or Trump more negatively?
Well, Trump chose to double down on this claim by his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, this false claim that immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were eating pets.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets.
And we were able to ask about that in real time. And there were some positive reactions to things Trump said, but mostly they were limited to a couple issues.
So zooming out, how have these deciders shifted over the course of the campaign?
Well, on a basic level, they've become more firm in their decision. Nearly half of those who were uncommitted to Biden or Trump in the spring were committed to Harris or Trump in the fall. And the biggest movement were among those who were leaning toward Biden. Harris really helped consolidate Democrat support among that group.
I actually went Democrat this time. Just seeing how the country's been ran under both administrations, as well as seeing them in the debates, how their tones were so different.
It got me to the point where I might vote, though. You know what I mean? In my mind, I want to give her, fresh start. Give a woman, if she does become president, give her a shot. So I might vote.
The other was interesting of who still remained undecided toward the end. They were some voters who were really conflicted and had very different views than firm voters about both the economy as well as the candidates.
When President Trump was in office, at least my personal finances were slightly better. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was drastically different, but things were, at least it felt better.
After the break, we dig deeper into how the economy and other issues are factoring into these decisions for voters. We'll be right back. So, Scott, I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the issues that the deciders really care about. And I imagine that probably an issue that came up a lot is the economy. Tell me a little bit about what you were able to glean from talking to these voters about how they were feeling about the economy and how that was influencing their views on who they might vote for.
The economy and inflation were two issues that stuck out consistently among these decider voters. One thing about these voters is they tend to care less about lots of issues. You know, they're less politically engaged, so they're not paying attention to everything. But they said these issues, the economy and inflation, were just as important as people who were committed to a candidate. One other thing is that they're generally negative about the economy.
No matter where you are in the country, no matter what state, no matter what demographic, I think, the overall state of the economy is something that weighs heavily on everybody's day-to-day life.
Which is still so interesting because, we look at all these economic factors right now and, objectively, the economy is doing, pretty all right, or maybe it's sort of good right now, but that's not reflected in what you heard, it sounds like.
It really isn't. Even digging down to specific issues like inflation, most of these voters said that inflation was getting worse, even in our October poll. So at
which point that wasn't the case, right?
Exactly. We had seen inflation really cool down to traditional levels. So some of the perceptions are at odds with reality among these voters. But those perceptions do matter, and it particularly was true for those who were leaning toward Harris, but not definitely supporting her. Harris's firm supporters thought the economy was good.
I mean, there's work out there. You just got to do it. You know what I mean? You can't expect the government to hand out for you. And that's just the way I look at it. So that's why when they say about the economy not being good, I think it's good.
But those who said they were probably voting for Harris generally thought the economy was bad.
And then what about immigration and border security? How did that fit into what folks were telling you about what was on their minds in terms of thinking about who they might vote for?
Well, immigration ranked as one of the more important issues in the poll. It wasn't the top, but it was high up there. And it was also one of those where people in the decider group, those who were uncommitted toward a candidate or maybe didn't turn out in regular elections, were really in the middle of the political spectrum on immigration. They weren't heavily supportive of offering a path to legal status for undocumented immigrants in the country, but they also weren't overwhelmingly supportive of mass deportations. So they really differed from people who were firmly supported of Harris as well as those who strongly supported Trump. Voters who were strongly supportive of Trump, who were firmly in his camp, were much more conservative on immigration, much more supportive of mass deportation than those who were probably supporting him. And this came out in our interviews, too. There were some voters who would offer up criticisms of Trump before saying that they're probably going to vote for him.
I agreed with some of the things he did as far as specifically the border. The little bit of a strict policy on that, I think, was something that interests me more. However, obviously the January 6th situation that's something you can't really overlook.
So you talked about the economy, you talked about immigration and how that influenced some voters and their thinking. What about reproductive rights?
I mean, one thing that showed consistently among voters overall in these states as well as these deciders is that most people support legal abortion.
Abortion issue was a big deal because it's like we came up with this whole change for women's rights, and then it just gets reversed so quickly.
That is a huge issue that has benefited Harris, even though it ranks relatively in the middle on voters' top issues, if you ask them on a list. And it's also a particularly strong motivator for those who are Democrats but are looking for a good reason to turn out.
Recently, I had a friend who needed to take care of an unexpected pregnancy, and just thinking about, is that friend safe to make that decision? These are things that I started to think about, and I wouldn't have even thought about that before Roe got overturned. is it's another thing that I could just base my vote on.
So does that matter in terms of the ways that reproductive rights have become a part of this campaign? I mean, is it the effect on these voters' thinking significant?
Well, it's complicated. One thing to mention is that many of these voters are going to be voting for a candidate who they don't fully agree with. That's true in a lot of elections, but it's really true for these voters who are really just making their final decision in the final month. You know, we talked about reproductive rights. 60% of voters who said they were probably voting for Trump in our October poll said they think abortion should be legal in all or most cases.
As a moderate, I think it's fair that you should want to choose what happens to your own body.
That's pretty striking for an issue that's been right in front of people in the news. They've got other reasons for supporting Trump.
I'm starting to lean more towards the Republican Party just on the simple fact that I have a base to go off of as far as former President Trump's leadership. Kamala Harris is also in a leadership position currently. However,
Wait, so they're willing to vote for Trump even though they're pro-abortion access and that Trump is the candidate that is most likely to limit abortion access? Like, they're just willing to look past that?
That's right. They're not single-issue voters on that issue. They have other considerations. You know, it was an example of clearly one of Harris's strongest issues and where voters, including these deciders, trusted Harris more to handle the issue. But Trump had these big advantages on other topics like economy and immigration. So for some voters, that was a deal breaker, right? You know, where Harris's willingness to protect abortion rights was going to be the reason that they supported her. But for some Trump voters, they were willing to look past that.
I'm also curious about the Israel-Gaza war and whether that was on the radars of the folks that you talked to.
It's a really complicated issue. Voters tended to rank it pretty low. If you ask them to list of 10 or 12 issues like we did and how important was U.S. policy on Israel and Gaza, you know, it ranked well below the economy, abortion, or other topics. But it came up in follow-up interviews. It's sort of something that's on the minds of voters. I talked to one voter in Wisconsin who was leaning toward Harris and seemed like she was going to eventually get to Harris. But when I asked about the things she was concerned about, voting for Harris or Biden, this was the main thing that she talked about.
My main frustration, which is carried through even with Kamala becoming the candidate, is the Israel-Palestine issues.
She was really sympathetic with people in Gaza being attacked and thought that the Biden administration hadn't done enough.
I'm struggling to even get myself to go to the polls because of how bothered I am by how it's being handled by both parties, and the lack of courage people are showing to stand up to AIPAC or whoever it is who's driving the narrative.
And yet had so many negative things to say about Trump that she was probably going to fall into Harris's camp reluctantly.
Well, that's the question, right? Because during the primary process, you know, we saw a lot of protest voting or people suggesting that they might ultimately sit out the general election because they worried that Biden and then Harris, that they would not do enough to protect people in Gaza. I guess, has that borne out? Like, have you seen evidence through the folks that you've talked to here that there are people who are ultimately deciding, look, I think I'm just going to sit this one out because I'm so concerned about Israel, Gaza, and that like my protest vote would be more meaningful?
Yeah. I didn't find a lot of specific people who voiced that view that they're going to stay out in protest, but it definitely was a soft spot of support for Harris. It also gave Trump an opportunity. You know, Trump has been even more supportive of Israel than Biden or Harris, at least in his rhetoric. And yet, when voters are asked who they trust to handle the issue, it's one of Harris's weaker issues. And so I think it's a weak spot for her. It is also one that, for voters that are less engaged or less committed to turning out, it is a demotivator for those who might otherwise vote Democratic.
So, Scott, in your most recent polling article involving deciders, you also just looked at the state of play for the key swing states this cycle as a whole. And you found that the presidential race is basically tied in all of these key places. What does that tell you about the state of the race here at the very, very end where we find ourselves now.
It tells us that if you're looking to try to figure out, who's going to win, the best thing to look at is now the vote results. It's time for the voters to speak.
It just boils down to I need to be educated and be able to walk in a little more confidently to the polls.
I really don't like Trump. I can say that I'm not a big fan of Harris, but, it's like the lesser two evils kind of logic with me.
I don't know. I just have complete dissatisfaction with the entire political process in this country, People say, well, choose the lesser of two evils. Well, the lesser of two evils is still evil.
It's very easy to say, promise the world. But at the end of the day, having those promises come true is something completely and drastically different.
It's time for us to see who actually turns out and who can motivate voters to show up. Both candidates have a shot in all of these states, is the other thing that I take away, is that none of these 7 states are really firmly heading in one direction. And so as much as we think about the country as, locked into, and they are, I think this poll shows that that's really the sum of a lot of these small decisions that many of them have had to make, may still be making in the final days, about whether to show up at the early voting site, whether to get that ballot in time, whether they miss the voter registration deadline, though some of those opportunities are passed.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Scott Clement is the polling director for The Post. The voters you heard from were Emily Dems, Richard Schall, Malik Williams, Julio Sanchez, Casey Campbell, and David A., who asked that we not use his full last name. This week, the news feels like all election all the time. But before we go, we want to bring you a couple other notable stories outside of politics. First, in the Middle East, Israel informed the United Nations on Monday that it will cease to recognize the UN's Agency for Palestinian Refugees. What we're talking about is the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. And it's hard to overstate its role in the Gaza Strip. For a long time, UNRWA has been a major employer in Gaza, as well as a source of aid, social services, healthcare, and education. But Israeli officials have been critical of UNRWA. They say that the agency has been infiltrated by Hamas, and they've alleged that more than a dozen of its employees were involved in the October 7th attack, a claim that UNRWA denies. Last week, Israel's legislature banned this agency from operating in Israeli territory. And now that Israel has terminated its recognition of UNRWA, there are fears that it could make the humanitarian crisis in Gaza even worse. In other, less serious news, back here in the U.S., TGI Fridays has filed for bankruptcy. I have to say, this news is personally devastating to me as someone who grew up believing that there is no finer delicacy on earth than a TGI Fridays mozzarella stick. But according to our colleagues on the business desk, this bankruptcy filing reflects a difficult year for lots of chain restaurants like TGI Fridays. These chains have been struggling against a steep decline in foot traffic, as many of their core customers are skipping sit-down dining in favor of eating at home. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. This is a big week, and we're going to be publishing Post Reports more often than usual so that you can get the latest on how voting is going across the country and what we know about the results. So remember, look for us in your feeds on Election Day afternoon, and again in the wee hours of Wednesday morning with whatever we know by then about the vote count. We'll also be back whenever we have a winner in the presidential election, and we'll have episodes on all the key House and Senate races and ballot questions. Today's show was produced by Laura Benshoff with help from Peter Bresnan. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Maggie Penman. Thanks to Emily Guskin and Donna Casada. I'm Martine Powers. Happy Election Eve. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.